Good morning, everybody. All the usual things. This poor man, his cell phone went off during a lecture. He has never been the same since then. Just a few sort of book housekeeping things. I see that there are a few of those booklets left. I'm not very keen to take them back. So if anyone is toying with the idea, go. They are at the Bay Bookshop in the foyer. Yeah. Thank you very much, many of you, for the interesting points you've raised and drawn my attention to. And I'm always very anxious to continue these conversations. So if you would have anything you would like to raise, which came out of this course, then I have told the office that they are welcome to give my email address to anyone who wants it. So please take advantage of that if you wish to. Right. Well, today we hopefully finish off. We've only got 18 years to do today, so relatively speaking, we're in comfort zone. And let's start with the shocking event which scandalized the world nearly 3 years ago, and that was in March 2014, the Russian Federation announced that it had annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Now, the Ukraine, of which Crimea had previously been a part, immediately denounced this as a violation of international law. Most world leaders condemned it as the illegal occupation of the territory of a sovereign state. The other members of the G8 immediately suspended Russia from the group and immediately enforced sanctions on Russia. And these sanctions, incidentally, are not just toothless tigers. They prohibit the sale or the purchase of goods in several sectors, especially those related to tourism. 7 ports were listed where cruise ships were not allowed to dock. Individuals were hit with travel bans and asset freezes. Visa and MasterCard both suspended services in the Crimea, and both the United Nations and the European Union passed a vote rejecting the annexation and affirming the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. So, no doubt then where the world stood on this shocking event. However, I hope that those of you who have been following the last 4 days will not have found this annexation too surprising and may not even have found it too shocking. And like so many events, its roots lie deep in the past, but let's begin to make sense of it by going back to 29th of March 2000, and that was the date when Vladimir Putin was elected president of the Russian Federation. There he was in 1999, and here he is today. And I suppose, you know, when you think of it, 18 years later, he hasn't worn too badly, really. But when he became president in 2000, it had been just 10 years since the once mighty Soviet Union of Socialist Republics had been formally dissolved. And the decade since then, in other words, the 1990s, had been an absolutely disastrous one for the Russian people. And they had found the adjustment from a communist command economy to a capitalist market economy very difficult indeed. In 1985, 5 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the World Bank had calculated that 1.5% of Russians were living below the poverty line. 10 years later, in 1995, the World Bank calculated there were now 40% living below the poverty line. Life expectancy had dropped by an average of 7 years. Alcohol-related deaths rose by 80% in the 1990s. Deaths from infectious and parasitic diseases shot up by 100%, mainly because the medicines were no longer available to the poor. In 1988, $1 was worth 1 ruble. In 1998, $1 was worth 30 rubles. So, there are plenty of other indicators one could give you, but you get the idea. It was a disastrous decade for Russia. Foreign affairs were as humiliating as domestic ones. In 1991, almost the last step that President Gorbachev took on the world stage was to attend the G8 summit in London. Russia was not invited again until 1998. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia was not able to prevent the expansion of NATO when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1998, and the Baltic and the Balkan states joined in 2002. So this is the expansion of NATO. And you can see the paler the colors, the more recent their accession. And these were all countries, the ones on the eastern border, they were all countries which Russia regarded as being in its sphere of influence. And she claimed that this expansion contravened a long-held promise not to enlarge NATO beyond East Germany. And similarly, she was unable to prevent most of these states from joining the European Union by 2004. So the whole sort of momentum of world politics is swinging against Russia. But the worst humiliation was much closer to home. When the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1991, many previously subject nationalities like the Estonians, Latvians, Armenians, Uzbeks, and at least 12 others gained total independence. However, this is such a complicated part of the world that still left no less than 100 ethnic groupings inside the Russian Federation. And some of these 100 said that their claims to independence were every bit as good as the Estonians and the Georgians, etc. And President Yeltsin managed to make compromise agreements with all but one of them, which gave them varying degrees of local autonomy. The one which refused to sign the agreement, of course, was Chechnya. And Chechnya, you can see on the map there, in the red, it's a tiny area, 6.7 thousand square miles. It's home to a Muslim population of 1.25 million. In other words, it's about 2/3 of the land area and the population of the Crimea. Now, instead of signing an agreement, the Chechens declared their independence in 1991. An attempt to make them retract broke down, and in 1994, President Yeltsin sent in troops to regain control of the territory. And in spite of overwhelming superiority in men, weaponry, and air support, the Russians were outclassed by the Chechens. How could this have happened? In the first attack, they lost more tanks than they lost in the battle for Berlin in 1945. The Russians then subjected the capital city, Grozny, which you can see marked there, to the heaviest bombing campaign since the destruction of Dresden. And at last, Grozny fell, only to be retaken again by the Chechens within a matter of months. and the Russian troops, who were mostly raw recruits with only minimal training, became defeatist and demoralized. And the war attracted massive public criticism, abroad because of its brutality, and at home because of its failure. And in 1996, Yeltsin signed a peace treaty with the Chechens, granting them autonomy and agreeing to withdraw Russian troops. So, you can imagine how humiliated Russians felt by this episode. Less than 10 years before, they'd been prepared to take on the United States. Now they couldn't even impose their will on this tiny breakaway republic, the 75th largest unit in the Russian Federation. And the national sense of shame was acute. Now, these are the Yeltsin years, and I just thought you might like a little reminder of the Yeltsin years. Do you remember Yeltsin?
Вот Борис Николаевич мне сейчас, когда уже мы встретились, он дал краткое изложение заседания Кабинета министров, но я его еще не читал. Вот почитайте.
Пенсия тоже жесткий. Садись.
Why am I not getting out of it? Yeah. Get me back onto my PowerPoint. Thanks very much. I mean, Yeltsin was a very unusual character produced by a very unusual situation, and I mean, obviously his alcoholic moments made good copy, but he did live, of course, to 76, which is about 15 years over the average age of a Russian male. So he didn't do that badly. Anyhow, so this was the situation when Yeltsin appointed Putin as a prime minister, in fact, his fourth prime minister in about 14 months. And no sooner had he appointed Putin as prime minister than Yeltsin very unexpectedly resigned about 6 months early, leaving Putin in a very powerful position to campaign for the presidency. But when Putin became acting president and prime minister, almost his first public act was to renew the war against Chechnya. And the Chechens gave him the ideal excuse by invading the neighboring republic of Dagestan. Can you all see it? I mean, the amazing thing is, who's ever heard of these places? But in their own context, in their own part of the world, these are important people. And they invaded Dagestan, thinking that they would be welcomed by the local population as liberators. However, much to their surprise, they were strongly rejected, giving the Russians a pretext to strike back. Now, any chance that public opinion might still be anti-war was dispelled when a series of apartment bombings in Moscow and other Russian cities, which killed 300 and maimed another 1,000, was attributed to the Chechens. It was such a conveniently timed development that it's often been suggested that the Russian Secret Service deliberately staged a provocation which would justify the use of military action. Everybody follow? Now, one person who made that suggestion was Alexander Litvinenko, whose death by radionuclide poisoning in 2008 became an international scandal. He was actually killed in London by, we don't know actually, but the thought is by KGB agents who had met him there to talk about, his past. And another person who made the same suggestion, in other words, that the war had been deliberately fanned again, was Anna Politkovskaya, the journalist who was murdered in the lift shaft of her Moscow apartment in 2008. Now, whether that's true or not, whether they did deliberately sort of re-energize the war, the Russians had put the intervening years, in other words, between 1996 and 2000, to good use. And they were now much better organized, much better equipped, and this time they overthrew the feuding Chechen rebels in 4 months. And Putin flew to Chechnya on a George Bush-style mission-accomplished operation, and by a helpful coincidence, it happened to be the week before the presidential elections. And the Russians rallied with relief around a leader who would restore their dented pride. And Putin gathered more than double the votes. In fact, Putin was almost unknown to the Russian people when he became acting president and prime minister. But he now gathered more than double the votes of his nearest challenger. And the popularity that he earned over Chechnya has clung to him for the rest of his career. However, let me stress that this operation in Chechnya wasn't forced on a reluctant Putin by a situation which he'd inherited. It very much accords with his own deeply held beliefs. Putin has publicly said many times that the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I quote, was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. As for the Russian people, it was a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. The epidemic of collapse has spilled over to Russia itself. End of quote. And the worst case scenario of international observers is that Putin will go on trying as far as possible to restore the borders of the old Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And in some ways, I have a certain sympathy for his position. I mean, after the dissolution of the British Empire, many Britons felt much like that, including, of course, most prominently, Winston Churchill. The Spanish felt exactly the same after the loss of their empire in the 19th century. And I can well understand that Putin's stance is one which resonates with the majority of the Russian people. Now, the West was not happy about the methods used in Chechnya, but it was prepared to accept that it was essentially a domestic matter. But not so Putin's next adventure in foreign policy. When the Republic of Georgia established its independence in 1989, then the provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, can you see them? Top left and center. The provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where there was a dominantly Russian population, wanted to opt out of the independence that the Georgians had won. And in both states, Russian-backed separatists took control, and law and order eventually had to be enforced by a joint peacekeeping force of Russians, Georgians, and Ossetians. And to simpletons like me, it seems incumbent upon the Georgians to handle a conflict with a very powerful neighbor with kid gloves. Instead, they rushed headlong into a series of provocations. And President Saakashvili, incidentally, you can always tell Georgian names because about 90% of them end on Vili, which means child of. President Saakashvili said that his short-term goal was membership of NATO. Well, that's a red rag, to the Russian bull. And the West, here's President Saakashvili, not looking very pleased with his, progress. And the West, and particularly the Americans, gave Saakashvili every encouragement. George Bush was all for offering the Georgians something called a membership action plan, which was a sort of preliminary stage on the way to full membership of NATO. And what George Bush's interest in Georgia was the pipeline from Azerbaijan to Turkey, which would lessen American dependence on Middle Eastern oil. So you can see how murky all this, political maneuvering is. Now, not surprisingly, Saakashvili interpreted this as a sign that he could expect Western support in any future conflict, in spite of the fact that the Russians said that expansion of NATO to Russia's borders would be taken in Russia as a direct threat to the security of our country. So, the markers are clearly laid down. Now, in this atmosphere of growing tension, there were some border disputes in Ossetia, and the Ossetians bombarded some Georgian villages. So, now the tension has spilled over and become physically a war situation. So, does Saakashvili come to his senses and start soft peddling? Far from it. The Georgian army was sent storming in to retaliate and suppress the Ossetians. The Russian army then came in to aid the Ossetians. Saakashvili said he promised not to harm Putin personally until he grew to full height. Putin responded, and I'm quoting again, by saying that he would hang Saakashvili by his balls. Saakashvili said Putin couldn't afford that much rope. That's how politics is conducted in that part of the world. And in a 3-week campaign, Russia crushed the Georgian resistance. And a week later, Russia announced that it recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia as separate republics. And to all intents and purposes, they are still part of Russia today. Now, once again, the West affected to be scandalized. But knowing what we know, isn't this a kind of natural development? So, and we're coming to the Crimea at last. That's 2 case studies from which to learn some object lessons. The first lesson is, don't mess with the Russians, especially when issues of nationality, no matter how contrived, are at stake. The second lesson is, don't be deceived into thinking you're going to get help from the West, no matter how sympathetic and supportive they might sound, because the West is not going to engage in a war in the heart of Russian territory, thousands of miles from their bases. And the third lesson is that if you happen to share a border with a superpower, tread on eggshells rather than give offense. That was how Finland retained its independence during the precarious post-war days of the Cold War. And you might think that these lessons could be learned from first principles. I always remember one of my school teachers used to say the one benefit of having a little bit of brain is that you don't have to learn everything from experience. And you'd think that that might apply here too. But let's go on to the Ukraine in 2014. Now, since becoming independent in 1991, the Ukraine had oscillated wildly between pro-Western and pro-Russian governments. And this corresponds roughly with a national fault line, in the west of which are territories, in other words, the pale shaded areas here, territories which were once part of the Kingdom of Poland or the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and to the east of which were once ancestral Russian and Cossack lands. Not for nothing is the country named Ukrainia, or borderland. And in 2010, power swung back to the Easterners with the election of the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych. And here was the sort of the election statistics. The blue areas, the bluer they are, the more pro-Russian they are, if you like. And unfortunately for the Ukraine, it's pretty much a sort of 50-50% division. And here is Yanukovych, the victor of the election, as well as in name. And I'm tempted to say, but I shouldn't, but I am, that you'd have to have strong political convictions to vote for him rather than his pro-Western opponent, Julia Tymoshenko. And it was Yanukovych who signed the agreement with Russia, giving her special rights to the naval base at Sebastopol for 30 years. Now, Sebastopol has always been the Trojan horse, if you like, through which Russia has infiltrated the Crimea. And when Yanukovych became president, the burning issue in Ukrainian politics was whether or not to accept what was called an European Union Association Agreement, which, a bit like the NATO agreement I talked about, is a sort of preliminary stage towards becoming a full member of the EU. Now, this association agreement was the result of 20 years of negotiations to establish closer ties with the European Union, which the western half of the Ukraine would love to do. The alternative was a Russian customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Well, you might think that a contest between the EU and Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan would be a no-brainer. But what the Russian offer has going for it was that the Ukraine is totally dependent on Russian oil, and in fact owed Russia millions or billions of dollars for oil previously supplied. So, in November 2013, Yanukovych formally rejected the proposed association agreement with the EU in favor of the Russian Union. Now, that led to protests and demonstrations in the central square, what's called the Maidan, in Kiev. And the crisis escalated with the government's violent reaction. The death toll mounted. Martyrs, whom activists later called the Heavenly Hundred. And by February, the country was more or less on the brink of civil war. And on the 21st of February, Yanukovych fled the country and sought asylum in Russia. The Ukrainian parliament declared him deposed and in his place appointed a pro-Western government. Now, of course, that was an unconstitutional coup d'etat, and many areas of the Ukraine totally rejected its validity. And one of the areas which rejected its validity was the Crimea. And 2 days after Yanukovych's flight, pro-Russian demonstrations were held in Sebastopol, and here you see them. They've all got Russian flags, nicely prepared for the occasion. And over the next 3 days, activists occupied most of the strategic sites in the Crimea and took over the Crimean parliament. and there was a significant presence of masked troops in combat dress without military insignia, subsequently referred to as little green men. And the Russians claimed that they were local militia who had seized their weapons from the Ukrainian army. But the CIC of NATO said that they were in fact proper Russian troops. On the 27th of February, so this is 4 days later, a special session of the Crimean Parliament, held behind locked doors in the presence of troops with Kalashnikovs and rocket launchers, nominated the Russian puppet Sergei Aksyonov as Prime Minister by 55 votes out of 64. Now, Aksyonov is actually a native Moldovan with only probable links to organized crime, who immediately made the use of the Ukrainian language illegal, and he has introduced a 3-minute rule which gives gays 3 minutes to disavow their sexual orientation. On March the 11th, the Crimean Parliament declared that it was now independent of the Ukraine, quoting the way, and as a precedent, quoting the way in which Kosovo had detached itself from Serbia, which was a very similar situation, with support from both the United Nations and the International Court of Justice. And finally, 5 days later, on March the 16th, Crimeans were asked to vote in a referendum on whether they wanted to join Russia or to become an autonomous area within the Ukraine. And here is the election poster. What it's saying was, the 16th of March, we make choices. And the choices between Russia with its flowing flag or the fascist threat of the Ukraine. And this is how Russia interprets any threat, just in the same way as any hostile activity in the United States is communist, whether that means that you don't like American football or whatever. In the same way, in Russia, anything that is hostile is fascist. And the Ukrainian nationalist movement is interpreted as being fascist. So this is the choice that the Crimeans are being offered. Anyhow, the vote, of course, surprise, surprise, went 98% in favor of joining Russia and only 2% in remaining part of the Ukraine. Authorities claimed that there was a turnout of 84%, while the Council of Crimean Tatars, who are equally, of course, prejudiced, said that it was more like 40%. At the United Nations, both the Security Council and the General Assembly declared the referendum invalid. However, in April, the Gallup organization and the United States-based Broadcasting Board of Governors came up with almost identical calculations that 83% of the Crimeans felt that the result accurately reflected public opinion. And in January 2015, 10 months later, a German research unit produced even higher approval rates. And I have absolutely no doubt that that referendum took place under conditions of intimidation and irregularity, and that the results were rigged. But I also think that the result was probably very close to the truth. From everything we've said in the past 4 days, we know that about 75% of the population of Crimea were Russian. Ukrainians formed 15% and the Tatars about 12%. 77% of Crimeans say that their native language is Russian. There's no area of the Crimea which does not have a majority of Russian speakers. The methods by which the annexation was achieved were far from satisfactory. But as for the result, the foreign minister of Kyrgyzstan summed it up succinctly, and I don't often quote him, when he said, "The results of the referendum in Crimea reflect the views of the region's absolute majority, and this is reality." And the president of Belarus, who's a Russian lapdog in most respects, said, "As for the Crimea, I do not like it when the integrity and independence of a country are violated. But today, Crimea is part of the Russian Federation. Whether the international community will legally recognize it as a region of the Russian Federation does not really matter. And I think that is, I feel, that is the sort of crux of the matter. And I have to say that the presidents of Kyrgyzstan and Belarus actually make much more sense than their counterparts in liberal democracies. Crimea seems to me to be the wrong issue on which to pick a quarrel with Putin. My forecast is, and I have a 0% success rate with similar predictions, that in the next few weeks, Putin's new best friend and admirer, the 45th President of the United States, will recognize the legality of the annexation in exchange for other concessions. Just to give you confidence in my powers of prediction, when we were in the Crimea in 2010, we had a wonderful guide, a sweet, motherly retired school teacher, and her greatest fear was that the Russians were just biding their time, choosing their moment when to take back the Crimea. And I remember saying to her, "Don't worry, Irina, it'll never happen. That's in the past." And of course, where are we now? And I'm slightly mystified by the world's support for Ukraine's claims to the Crimea. It's not as if post-Soviet Ukraine is in any sense a model state. You might even regard it as a failed state. The Global Corruption Index ranked Ukraine 135th in its index of corruption-free countries, 12 places lower even than Russia. You might be interested to know where South Africa ranks on that. Where do you think? 65th. Not such bad news. In the freedom of press rank, anyhow, many of you might think, well, that just doesn't sound sense, but it makes clear how corrupt the Ukraine is. And in the freedom of press rankings, Ukraine came 107th. South Africa, incidentally, was 39th. And on the democracy index, it ranked 88th, listed in the category hybrid regime, which comes between flawed democracy and authoritarian. And Russia actually ranked lower on that. It was 132nd, and South Africa was 37th. And when President Yanukovych fled to Russia, he wasn't able to take all his assets with him. Unfortunately, he had to leave behind his country estate. And here are a few more views of it, with its yacht pier, equestrian club, shooting range, tennis courts, hunting grounds, private zoo, automobile museum, a golf course, ostrich farm, dog kennels, numerous fountains and man-made lakes, 2 helicopter pads, and a small church. I visited Kiev in 2010, and I was very impressed, even dazzled by Kiev. But at the time I wrote, the collapse of the Soviet Union has not opened the door to the promised land. The economy has fallen into the hands of mafioso, most of whom were former communist-era bosses. The shiny suits, cars with tinted windows, and shaven-headed gangsters parading their peroxided moles create a climate where gangsterism is not concealed but flaunted. Right, so I think this is a strange situation, but this is where we are still at. Now, in the meanwhile, how's Crimea faring as an integral part of the Russian Federation? How have they coped in the last 2 years? Well, most Crimeans have received Russian passports, although interestingly, only 1% gave up their Ukrainian passports. And they've re-registered their properties in accordance with Russian legislation. And Crimea's integration into Russia took place with unprecedented speed. The currency, the laws, the school curricula, and even trade changed dramatically in the space of a few months. the Crimean Peninsula became de facto part of Russia without a single shot being fired. But to see how much things have changed, apparently you have to visit the railway station in the capital city, Simferopol. Before the annexation, you couldn't move for the number of people on the station's forecourt. Now, apart from a few suburban trains going to other parts of the Crimea, no trains run there now. There aren't long-distance trains to Kiev or any other part of the Ukraine any longer. And that, of course, divides families even further and complicates people's ability to move around. And the pro-Russian majority, who are convinced of the legitimacy of Crimea's historical return to Russia, are not interested in the domestic problems created by a geopolitical crisis like this. The sanctions, the blockade, and other problems, they perceive these as a conspiracy against Russia and against them. Their slogan is, "Let rocks rain from the sky. We have come home." Nationalism and the feeling of coming home, at least for now, conceals the social, economic, and mobility problems that people face. The average monthly salary in Crimea today is about 25,000 rubles, which is about $400. 1 year ago, it was 15,000 rubles. But because of the devaluation of the ruble, that was about $400 back then too. Wages have gone up, but the purchasing power of the individual has fallen due to inflation. McDonald's was the first international company to announce its closure on the peninsula. And even Russian companies do everything they can to hide their relationship with the Crimea. They do not want to be seen to be doing business in the Crimea for fear of sanctions and reputational damage. And so they're ready, if they have to deny any links to the peninsula. And today in Crimea, there is a growing sense of isolation. For example, there is only one television network airing a news channel, which is called Euronews, and it's broadcast in Ukrainian. And the big question is, will sanctions get better or worse? And Crimeans are still endearingly optimistic. One priest who was interviewed for the BBC said, "Putin has, thank God, saved us from this fascism that has impregnated Europe and finally taken us back to the motherland. He is a hero of the people here." And generally, the reaction in mainland Russia to the annexation was euphoric. Immediately afterwards, Putin's popularity ratings reached all-time high levels. And as I've said before, Russians say, in our hearts and minds, Crimea has always been Russian. So, for the time being, the Crimeans are the ones who have to bear the brunt of this sort of friction. But when you compare what they're going through now with what we've talked about in the last 3 days, slavery, mass executions, ethnic cleansing, war, one suspects that they will somehow find a way to see themselves through. Now, of course, the most vulnerable and the least logical aspect of Crimea's new affiliation is that presently the only land route out of Crimea is that 3-mile-wide isthmus of Perikop, which we looked at yesterday, which links it to the Ukraine. And the Russians' long-term solution to that is to build a bridge from Kerch to Taman, and that's on the very easternmost sort of tip of the peninsula, where a bridge is sort of mechanically possible. It'll have 4 road lanes and 2 rail lanes. It'll be 2.8 miles long, slightly shorter than the famous bridge linking Sweden to Denmark. Construction started in May 2015, and it's alleged that it'll be completed in August 2019. And finally, it needs to be pointed out that the world is so indignant about the Crimea. Is there another picture of this bridge? No. But there's incidentally, you can see on the eastern tip of the Crimea, where the bridge is linking, that very sort of furthest point on the east, which will link it to mainland Russia. Now, finally, it needs to be pointed out that the world is so indignant about the Crimea, not so much because of their love of the Crimea, but for fear of where precedents like this might lead to. And the first illustration of where this might lead followed straight on from the Crimea. And the two easternmost provinces of Ukraine, Donetsk in the sort of pink and Luhansk in the yellow, took heart from the example of Crimea. Now, both provinces have a majority of ethnic Russians, a slight majority, about 58% ethnic Russians, but a very large majority of Russian speakers. And you have to remember that Ukrainian has only been an official language since 1991. And both provinces have old-fashioned smokestack industries which are closely tied to the Russian economy. Pro-Russian demonstrations were staged in the cities, which the Ukrainian government took steps to suppress. In May 2014, separatists proclaimed the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic and took control of the administration of both provinces. Now, the Ukrainian government, fresh from its negotiations about membership of the EU and NATO, sent in troops to restore them, initially with some success, but they were later beaten back after a Russian humanitarian convoy crossed the border. And here is the Russian humanitarian convoy parked on the border, and here it is moving into the Ukraine. And this is the allegedly bringing water and medical supplies and so on. And what happened to the support that the Ukraine was expecting from their Western allies? Or, put it another way, had they learned nothing from what had happened in Georgia 8 years previously? Now, naturally, the Russian army, or the Russians, deny any suggestions that they're giving the separatists military support, while United Nations observers estimate that about 20% of the troops in Russia, of the separatist troops are Russian. It's just another example of what's now called post-truth politics, what used to be called downright lies. Eventually, an agreement was brokered by the French and the Germans, which agreed that rebel-held territory would be reintegrated into Ukraine in exchange for an overhaul of the Ukrainian constitution that would grant both provinces self-governing status within the Ukraine by the end of 2015. Now, this involved holding elections in both provinces, but no one has yet thought of a way to ensure that these elections would be free and fair. Serious concerns about this caused those elections to be postponed from October 2015 to February 2016, then April 2016, then July, then November, and most recently to sometime in 2017. In the meanwhile, the breakaway separatist governments continue to rule those disputed provinces. It's been remarked on that Putin has lately gone rather quiet on the Ukrainian crisis. And once again, you have to ask if this is the right quarrel to pick with the Russians. The formula of local separatists agitating for independence from their current rulers, assisted by Russian troops, of whose existence Russia flatly denies, is so effective that everyone is casting about to see where the next victim might be. One place thought likely was Transnistria, a sliver of land along the eastern border of Moldova. You may have heard it mentioned at the time as being a likely candidate for the next Russian land grab. And once again, that's the yellow area there. And once again, it has a majority of ethnic Russians. And in 2006, it voted by 94%, and I think that was a genuinely free election, to become part of Russia. Its weakness is that it does not share a border with Russia. Can you all see where it is? And as a result, the Russians rejected their application. Now, two other states, which are with a dangerously high population of ethnic Russians, are Latvia and Estonia. Latvia has 26% Russian population, and Estonia has 24%. And it's always assumed that Putin would love to regain the healthy economies and the access to the Baltic Sea provided by these states. And of course, unlike Transnistria, they do share a land border with Russia. So you might argue that they're much more vulnerable. But their best hope of security lies in the fact that unlike South Ossetia or the Crimea or Donetsk or Transnistria, the Russian population is not concentrated in a single border region. In fact, in Latvia, 3/4 of the ethnic Russians live in the capital city, Riga, which is 200 miles from the Russian border. And for the Russians to make an advance on Riga would be a very provocative step. And I think my reading of Putin is that that is not the kind of risk that he is likely to take. The Russian economy is in quite a fragile state, and the fluctuations in the oil price have been particularly damaging to Russia. Russia could not afford to risk an unjust war as opposed to a just war, as in Georgia or the Ukraine, against a potentially powerful opponent such as NATO. However, one has to accept that calculations about Russia do not often follow the normal rules of logic. As Winston Churchill truly said, "I cannot forecast to you the actions of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." But, following the idea of the Russian dolls. But perhaps there is a key, he went on, and that key is self-interest. And when I first started preparing the lectures, I thought that would be a sort of ringing note on which to end. But then I asked myself, which nation's policies are not shaped by self-interest? Certainly not Britain, or France, or China, or, under its new president, the United States. Although most countries put their case slightly more subtly. So, I don't condemn Russia for following a policy of self-interest. And interestingly, in Oxford, where the weather is fine and dry today, we have a Russian dentist. And I often talk politics to him when I haven't got things inside my mouth. And it's interesting that he's a very sort of calm, quiet, reasonable person. But his view is that Russia's just responding to the aggression of the West. And he feels that Russia is encircled by the West. And every time I say to him, well, what about Crimea? He says, well, what about the missile shield that the West have just erected on the borders of the NATO countries? And I said, well, I hadn't even heard of it. Oh, yes, this is front page news in Russia every day. And then, of course, a couple of weeks ago, the West mounted huge maneuvers, on the borders of the NATO countries, in the Baltic states and Poland. The Russians feel threatened by the West. We feel that the Russians are threatening us. They feel exactly the same. And so, this is a very complicated problem, and one of my few bright hopes for President Trump is that he will achieve, perhaps a more normal understanding with the Russians, and that the situation will become better adjusted to the realities of 21st century politics. Thanks very much. The Balkan states joined in 2002. So this is the expansion of NATO. And you can see the paler the colors, the more recent their accession. And these were all countries, the ones on the eastern border, they were all countries which Russia regarded as being in its sphere of influence. And she claimed that this expansion contravened a long-held promise not to enlarge NATO beyond East Germany. And similarly, she was unable to prevent most of these states from joining the European Union by 2004. So the whole sort of momentum of world politics is swinging against Russia. But the worst humiliation was much closer to home. When the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1991, many previously subject nationalities like the Estonians, Latvians, Armenians, Uzbeks, and at least 12 others gained total independence. However, this is such a complicated part of the world that still left no less than 100 ethnic groupings inside the Russian Federation. And some of these 100 said that their claims to independence were every bit as good as the Estonians and the Georgians, etc. Good morning, everybody. All the usual things. This poor man, his cell phone went off during a lecture. He has never been the same since then. Just a few sort of book housekeeping things. I see that there are a few of those booklets left. I'm not very keen to take them back. So if anyone is toying with the idea, go. They are at the Bay Bookshop in the foyer. Yeah. Thank you very much, many of you, for the interesting points you've raised and drawn my attention to. And I'm always very anxious to continue these conversations. So if you would have anything you would like to raise, which came out of this course, then I have told the office that they are welcome to give my email address to anyone who wants it. So please take advantage of that if you wish to. Right. Well, today we hopefully finish off. We've only got 18 years to do today, so relatively speaking, we're in comfort zone. And let's start with the shocking event which scandalized the world nearly 3 years ago. And that was in March 2014, the Russian Federation announced that it had annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Now, the Ukraine, of which Crimea had previously been a part, immediately denounced this as a violation of international law. Most world leaders condemned it as the illegal occupation of the territory of a sovereign state. The other members of the G8 immediately suspended Russia from the group and immediately enforced sanctions on Russia. And these sanctions, incidentally, are not just toothless tigers. They prohibit the sale or the purchase of goods in several sectors, especially those related to tourism. 7 ports were listed where cruise ships were not allowed to dock. Individuals were hit with travel bans and asset freezes. Visa and MasterCard both suspended services in the Crimea, and both the United Nations and the European Union passed a vote rejecting the annexation and affirming the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. So, no doubt then where the world stood on this shocking event. However, I hope that those of you who have been following the last 4 days will not have found this annexation too surprising and may not even have found it too shocking. And like so many events, its roots lie deep in the past, but let's begin to make sense of it by going back to 29th of March 2000, and that was the date when Vladimir Putin was elected president of the Russian Federation. There he was in 1999, and here he is today. And I suppose, you know, when you think of it, 18 years later, he hasn't worn too badly, really. But when he became president in 2000, it had been just 10 years since the once mighty Soviet Union of Socialist Republics had been formally dissolved. And the decade since then, in other words, the 1990s, had been an absolutely disastrous one for the Russian people. And they had found the adjustment from a communist command economy to a capitalist market economy very difficult indeed. In 1985, 5 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the World Bank had calculated that 1.5% of Russians were living below the poverty line. 10 years later, in 1995, the World Bank calculated there were now 40% living below the poverty line. Life expectancy had dropped by an average of 7 years. Alcohol-related deaths rose by 80% in the 1990s. Deaths from infectious and parasitic diseases shot up by 100%, mainly because the medicines were no longer available to the poor. In 1988, $1 was worth 1 ruble. In 1998, $1 was worth 30 rubles. So, you know, there are plenty of other indicators one could give you, but you get the idea. It was a disastrous decade for Russia. Foreign affairs were as humiliating as domestic ones. In 1991, almost the last step that President Gorbachev took on the world stage was to attend the G8 summit in London. Russia was not invited again until 1998. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia was not able to prevent the expansion of NATO when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1998, and the Baltic and the